Hi, this is Audra Dahl, and I'm so glad you're here to join me on this side of the couch. Today I have Bob Hamp with me, and Bob started Think Differently Academy and also Think Differently Counseling, and he has been doing counseling, I think, for about 30 years. Is that right, Bob?
That's right. Yeah, I was licensed in the early 90s.
Wow, you must have one of those small little license numbers.
It's I don't know how many digits they are now, but mine is four digits.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It starts with a three. So
You're one of the early ones. So I would love to know first, what made you want to be a counselor?
yeah, that's actually a great place for us to start the conversation because I had every intent in my life not to be a counselor.
Oh, yeah.
My mom is a counselor, and
Uh-huh.
I say is because she still practices to some degree, even though she's in her late 80s.
Wow.
As a teenager growing up, I was like, that is the last thing I want to do. I never ever want to do that. Because what I was watching was kind of that 70s model of, plow through your guts and talk about all the feelings and, just kind of a very reflective, tell me more,
Yeah.
kind of model. So two things changed. One, the big one was literally I was born again when I was 14 years old and fairly early learned to hear God's voice. And he was as clear as I've ever heard him said, I want you to go get your degree and license as a counselor. So that was kind of the like, you better get on the path, dude. But then the other thing was when I first started down the path of my degree, I discovered marriage and family therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And marriage and family therapy was a little bit more like a chess game and a little bit less like plowing through the entrails of our soul.
Yeah.
And I loved kind of the strategic um, uh,
Systems.
systems. Yeah, the intellectual approach of emotional response
Mm-hmm.
kind of fit for me much more than what I had observed. And so it's one thing for the Lord to tell me, it's another thing for me to kind of open up my heart and digest it well. So those two things together really set the path. And so since then, since I was 18, I knew where I was headed. Then it was just a matter of getting the degrees and licenses.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you fight him long on it?
I think there was an initial kind of what, you're kidding, right?
Yeah.
But I was such a new believer at the time. I didn't know that it was okay to push back.
For a while.
Yeah. And so I don't think I really fought. I just had that internal resistance because I could feel it release when I discovered a model that was much more congruent to
Oh,
the way I operate.
yeah, yeah. So you do a whole lot of work with freedom and freedom teachings. And feel free to talk about a little bit about what you do at Think Differently Academy and teaching these classes.
Yeah, I love how you introduce. I do quite a bit of work. I would actually say it's the center of my target of my life's work.
Hmm.
And sometimes freedom. In fact, I'll say this and I'll elaborate on this in just a second. Freedom is elusive because of the ways that we think about it and the ways that we define it. And so to say my life's work is about freedom, I know kind of on the front end, people are likely to understand that in a particular way.
Hmm.
Part of that life's work is to help people shift their very understanding of what we're really talking about. Now, first and foremost, I described being born again at 14, but then doing a degree in marriage and family therapy. And early in practice, I was always keeping my eyes out for the intersection of both what I believed at my core about salvation and transformation through a relationship with God and everything I both understood and encountered because I was licensed as a, secular, whatever you want to call that. It was licensed to be a marriage and family therapist. And back then in LPC, as I was licensed to do that in any setting. And so encountered every kind of problem you expect to encounter when you're doing
Hmm.
professional counseling.
Yeah.
So trying to marry those two things throughout the 90s was a very helpful thing for me to think there's got to be something about the gospel and the administration of the gospel that's potent in terms of helping people change. And I think to some degree, we all know that, we all believe that. But
Yeah.
then I also think looking back at it, I think we compromise internally and say, but it can only do so much for us. And then we need EMDR, and then we
Mm-hmm.
need, whatever it might be. But my quest was to answer that question with all of my clinical knowledge and expertise, which of course grows every year because we learn more every year, but also with my core belief that it was the new birth that transformed me, and it was the discovery, the ongoing discovery of what that new birth meant that continued to transform me. It was marrying those two things over a decade's worth of time.
Mm-hmm.
And as I alluded to a minute ago, one of the very first things that began to shift for me was the recognition that even the conversation, the language around freedom can sometimes be a barrier to freedom itself. And so I would tell people sometimes the thing we need to help people get free from is their previous attempts to get free. Right.
True.
Right. So if I could just say it in a simple sentence, a lot of times we define freedom as no longer struggling with a particular behavior, thought, or feeling. And kind of the solution focused version of me combined with some scripturally, you know, um, deeper study began to shift my mind and my teaching to where freedom is more about becoming who we're created and redeemed to be instead of overcoming the bad things. It's about the genuine discovery and empowerment of my created and redeemed identity, which then overcomes things, as opposed to focusing on the overcoming and defining freedom as I'm now free from cigarettes, I'm now free from porn, I'm now free from anger. Instead, I'm free to be who I was created to be, who doesn't smoke, who doesn't look at porn, and who isn't, consumed with anger.
Yeah, I find that when I want to call it not a negative mindset, but the negative view of freedom is I'm free from one thing rather than I'm becoming something. It's kind of like even in parenting, you want to teach a child what you want them to do, not what you don't want them to do. And so I find when we focus on the former, the what I don't want to do, then all I'm doing is just shifting it to something else. Then, that's
Right.
why you get from one addiction to the next because you're not actually dealing with the root issue, which is not being the person you were designed to be, not being the image of
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, it's classic solution focused thinking.
Hmm.
But I also think if you can look at the scriptures through that lens, it's what I call prisoner thinking.
Hmm.
Prisoner thinks of freedom as getting out of jail,
Yeah.
but once you're out of jail, how do you live?
It's so interesting you say that because what just popped into my head years ago, back in 2017, we went to Italy and we went to the museum that I cannot say the name of because I don't speak Italian, but where Michelangelo's artwork is and the David is. And as you walk towards the David, you go down this hall, giant hall, and on either side is the works that they call the prisoners.
Yes.
And they call them the prisoners because Michelangelo saw his sculptures as emerging from the marble and from the stone, and all he had to do is release them. And the prisoners are prisoners as such because he died during the process of making them, so that he wasn't able to free them from the
Yeah.
stone.
And it's a perfect picture. I'd actually heard someone say that his description of quote unquote releasing them was to look at the piece of marble and figure out what wasn't his target statue and
Yeah.
get rid of everything that wasn't them so that what would remain was the statue he had in mind.
How awesome is that?
Right. It's the perfect picture that we're describing. So if
Mhm.
you focus on getting rid of things, you
Mhm.
could actually, cut off fingers and toes, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah.
But if you focus on releasing the person that God created us to be, then we're really focused on becoming. I'm
Mhm.
free. I'm not free from something. I'm free to be someone. And, you think about this in the garden, God didn't spend a lot of time with Adam and Eve talking about freedom because they already were.
Yes.
And so they weren't free from something. They were simply free to be.
Uh-huh.
So that one shift, I think, Audra, probably cascaded into dozens of shifts over the decades. But that at the core of my work is helping people think differently. So the idea is that think differently isn't just a clever phrase. It's not just a brand that we decided on.
Mm-hmm.
It's the actual, the translation of the word repent,
Mm-hmm.
which in Greek is metanoia, but in English is think differently.
Yeah.
And so helping people think differently about freedom, helping people think differently about their journey to freedom,
Uh-huh.
helping people think differently about God himself and his kingdom. And so changing the ways that we think instead of what we think, including redefining what freedom actually is.
So what do you see as the obstacles most often that keep people from this, other than not understanding the definition?
Yeah. But interestingly, I would say that that one is the top of the list
Mm-hmm.
because there's a teaching I do at length in the distinction between the two trees in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And the tree of life represents this kind of spontaneous God to us, God in us, and God through us. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents us trying to know right things and know right thing or wrong things and exercise our willpower to quote unquote do the right thing and not do the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that definition alone, changing the definition to becoming, really moves the mind back towards the tree of life. But then the next thing, to answer your question a second way, is people trying hard to live out what God told them to do instead of surrendering to Him doing it through them. And so, a single word way we could describe that is religion. Right? The belief that we're supposed to follow orders
Uh-huh.
and um, do exactly the things God tells us to in order to be free, as opposed to allowing Him to live through us, which is in itself freedom. Third,
I'm still swallowing your statement on this one. So go back again to the what you said. The second thing is that we
trying
are
trying hard to produce through effort
uh-huh.
what's designed to be released through surrender. So we try to force ourselves to become someone. It's like trying to force yourself to fall asleep, right?
Yeah.
Falling asleep is a natural process. When you try to force something that's natural, you actually prohibit or inhibit the natural function.
Okay.
So we look at that and go, I'm supposed to, whatever you fill in the blank, I'm supposed to read my Bible every day. I'm supposed to pray. I'm supposed to not look at porn. I'm supposed to, not have outbursts of anger, as opposed to when I surrender to God's move to me, I can't help but release his move through me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that like self-initiated attempt to produce outcomes, I think is the second obstacle.
Okay.
And then third, I was about to name, and since I already said it and you caught it on audio, third would be just distorted beliefs.
Uh-huh.
Anything from the beliefs we've already addressed to kind of more personal. What do I believe about myself? What have I learned in my family of origin about me that's not true? What have I learned in my traumatic experiences that's not true?
Mm-hmm.
What have I learned in my early relationships that's not true? And of course, you and I know when I use the word learned, it's more about imprinted than it is cognitively stored.
Right.
And so those things that are deep core beliefs would be the third obstacle that I would say to really walking in freedom.
Yeah, that the third one, it strikes me one because of the work that you do a lot now, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it's a saying I tell people a lot is no baby comes out of the womb with a low self-worth,
Right.
right? Low self-worth is a learned behavior,
Yeah.
you
One
know.
one of our distinctives is that we believe that the God created version of you is still locked up inside,
Mm-hmm.
waiting to be released. He's not calling you to become someone you're not. He's calling you to finally become who you have been all along.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No
See, and
baby. Love that.
that's part of where though I see going back to original comment that you made, about, the Bible's good for this stuff, or my faith is good for these things, but I need EMDR or whatever. And I see EMDR and brain spotting and whatever else as helping release those things that allow you to be
Right.
more
Yeah.
like that.
It's not that one technique or another technique is more or less spiritual. It's that
Hmm.
the goal is to release the true identity of the person within.
Yeah.
And so if there's a technique that you know or that I know or that we can be trained in that can help do that, I'm
Uh-huh.
all for it.
Yeah. I know you're doing a whole lot of work right now in abuse, and this is
Yeah.
where I wanted to spend most of our time today.
But I love the setup.
And I want to start with where I think we should always start with when we talk about things is a definition of abuse. And this is something that I have been looking for a really great definition of abuse for a few years now. And I'm not
Yeah.
finding one because I find one and I'm like, well, that's way too general. I found one in a book that basically said anything that your parents do that prohibit you from leading a life of full relationship and love and joy and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, then I've abused my kids every day. That's just way too,
General.
that's if I hurt your feelings, that's abuse. So how do you define abuse?
Yeah, it's interesting because I know you've heard me say this before. My definition is not as much a definition as it is a description, but at what I say is at the foundation of all abuse is the misassignment of responsibility.
Hmm.
Or to get a little more specific, when the abusive person makes their victim responsible for the abuser's well-being. But we could go deeper than that. They make them responsible to carry the impact of their drives. We make them responsible to carry the blame for their choices. The abuser makes them responsible to protect them.
Hmm.
And so abuse fundamentally is about misassigning responsibility, where an abusive person makes somebody else responsible for their well-being. Now, we could just call that codependence, except in an abusive relationship, there's a coercive element to it. Whether the coercive element is physical size and strength, whether the coercive element is, a relational imbalance where the person who's abusive is less interested in the relationship and therefore has more power.
Hmm.
But there's a power differential where the person who's abusive finds ways to enforce or coerce the victim to take responsibility for their, like I said, drives, behavior, protection, well-being, emotional states. And so, there's a lot of work these days in general in the abuse community with the idea that coercive control should also be legally forbidden in the same way that physical violence is.
Hmm.
And so they work to define coercive control. What are all the elements of coercive control? So my definition is more about the function of the misassignment of responsibility. But
Okay.
that's it's so broad, like you said, it's a broad definition.
But what about the person who is just verbally abusive to other people on a regular basis, but doesn't blame them or doesn't assign them responsibility, but just verbally vomit awful stuff onto people all the time?
Right. And so the thing is, most of the transfer of responsibility is covert, not overt.
Uh-huh.
So verbally vomiting on people is making other people responsible to carry the vitriol that you carried 2 minutes ago.
Okay.
Right. And that's kind of that first step, whether it's a sexual drive in the case
Uh,
of sexual abuse
uh-huh.
or emotional or physical,
Uh-huh.
there's some coercion to say you will carry the poison I have inside. Um, One of the things I say is every type of abuse, every form of abuse that we know, physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, narcissistic abuse, all those forms of abuse have at their foundation that transfer of responsibility. And
Yeah,
it's
I'm sorry. What's coming to mind with that is I love somebody told me a great response to somebody being rude to you, and it cuts the knees off of rude talk, right?
right.
Somebody says something rude to you, and you say back to them, "Gee, that sounded really rude. Did you intend for it to sound that way?"
And And the beauty of that response is it's actually placing the responsibility right back on them.
That's it. That's why it came to mind is I'm not accepting that from you. That one's all on you, but I'm giving you space and grace to back out of it gracefully,
An
right?
opportunity. Right.
An
I would say,
opportunity to do better. And I've yet to have anybody go, well, hell yeah, you know.
right, right.
And but I love that because it fits with what you're saying in the sense that I hadn't thought about it as a covert responsibility. Now it's up to you to carry all of this stuff. I'm awful things I'm saying to you. And you're right, it does because we carry it with us,
Right.
whether just temporarily or for forever if we don't do anything about it. And wow, okay. You've got my
So
mind thinking.
good, good. So teaching the abuse victim, and again, I
Mm-hmm.
hate the word, but it's just the common language around it.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching the abuse victim verbal and emotional boundaries is a crucial piece
Mm-hmm.
of the changing of the dynamic. So typically the way I describe it is, and I said this when I first taught this, and I had some people push back on it because of the adult child abuse kind of stuff that can happen. But in an adult emotionally abusive relationship, I described it as a covert agreement. You will hand me responsibility and I will accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that ongoing cycle of if you could just have dinner on the table, I wouldn't rage at you.
Yeah.
If you would give me more sex, I wouldn't be looking at porn or having affairs.
Mm-hmm.
If you would, and on, you've got those assignments of responsibility. And the covert agreement is that the victim, whether consciously or unconsciously says, okay, yeah, I'll try harder. I will take that responsibility. And so the way I've described it is the victim in emotional and psychological abuse often sees himself not as a victim, but as a special helper. If I could just get this right, they would finally be okay. If I could just do more or enough or do it better, they would finally stop their alcohol. They would finally stop their raging. They would finally stop, beating the kids if I could just do it better.
Wow. Yeah, I'm going through so many couples that I've seen that I just, it's that woman that just does not want to give up on her guy out of air quotes love,
Right.
but that's really the covert abuse that's happening.
Yeah. Stand by your man.
Stand by your man and or, if I leave now, then all my hard work is going to, benefit some other woman, not mine, because he'll get it after I leave him, you
Right.
know.
Right.
And so but I love the ability to point out or to help them see that this is part of the abuse that they're going through,
Yeah.
that they are taking on responsibility for how that person is and helping them be better when you can't. I tell people if you're holding on to responsibility, they don't have all of it to be able to change anything.
Right. Yeah. If you're, it's what, like I tell parents about their kids, if you're fearful about their grades, then they are not. Right. And so if in the same way in a relationship, if you are fretting about or working hard to get your partner to change, then
Hmm.
they won't because they don't need to.
Yeah.
And so the difficulty for the person in the victim role is they can make some changes, but the key change is to stop taking responsibility altogether.
Hmm.
And so one of the reasons why this often isn't handled well, I'll say it this way. In the counseling world, we've been taught that marriage is 50-50, right? And so, well, marriage is 50-50, abuse is not,
Right.
right? Abuse is the responsibility of the abuser,
100%.
100%. And for the dynamic to change, the victim must stop taking responsibility in every way that they take responsibility for their partner's behavior. That includes teaching them how to change. That includes doing all the work of scheduling the counseling appointments. Anything that the abuse victim is doing to try to get their partner to change, they've got to stop.
Yeah.
And it's incredible. And let me just say, personally speaking, it was very difficult to stop fixing things that I felt if I didn't fix them, and I've kind of hinted, some of my work on this comes from my own personal story, but to stop fixing things that I was convinced if I didn't keep fixing them, I would lose some of the most valuable things in my life.
Mm,
So there is a stake in it that's not just it's hard to stop.
yeah,
Hard to stop realizing the cost may be extreme.
absolutely. And what we think are the most important things in our lives at that time aren't necessarily.
Right. Right. And that is the thing that has to adjust in the mind of the victim is, it's kind of like what is it in the gospels? What does it profit you if you, gain this but lose your soul?
Right.
If you maintain the relationship but you lose your soul in the midst of it,
Hmm.
you are not in a relationship. You are simply somebody else's blow up doll,
Yeah.
emotionally, physically, in every way.
Yeah. You lose yourself, you lose your voice, you lose your person
Yeah.
in these situations.
And I think the fear is, like I said a minute ago, if I stop taking responsibility
Hmm.
and the other person doesn't pick it up, the relationship might end. And in reality, if I stop taking responsibility and the other person doesn't pick it up, there never was a relationship.
And that's a whole nother basket of eggs to dig into. I mean, because then have they been fooled their whole
Yeah.
relationship? Have they been a fool their whole relationship? I hear that a lot. Have they, who can they trust then if they thought they could trust this person, who can they trust? It just opens up another whole layer of that you have to go through in healing and all of this.
Those are the important conversations to help them get
Yeah,
ready.
yeah.
If they're ever going to get out of abuse, those are the conversations. What can you trust?
Hmm.
What can you legitimately put trust and hope in that won't disappoint you?
Only
And
one thing.
yeah, the other difficulty, obviously, our kind of our spiritual beliefs is the core of that. But there's another interesting thing about it, Audra. At the beginning of a lot of our abuse conferences, which is part of how we address this these days, because there's so many people coming our direction. I often say people ask the question, "What's wrong with me that this happened?"
Or happens over and
Right.
over.
And the answer is nothing is wrong with you. It's something right about you that the abuser preyed upon.
Hmm.
And so, because you're generous, because you're kind, because you're forgiving, because you're patient, because, all these qualities that in a mutual relationship would be powerful relational qualities work against you in a relationship where predation is the dynamic. And abusers are preying on the good qualities that good people have.
Yeah.
And again, that's a reason why it's hard for the victims to let go. But the other part about it is there comes a point in the journey where the abuse victim may begin to despise some of their best qualities.
Really?
I'm angry at me for being so patient.
Oh, okay. I see.
I'm angry at me for being so,
Hmm.
forgiving. I'm angry at me. Why didn't I stand up sooner? Why didn't I? And now it must be my fault that this happened to. I'm angry at me for being the kind of person. And now qualities that again would be positive in a healthy relationship
Hmm.
become something that the abuse victim in their recovery process needs to forgive themselves and say, okay, I'm going to embrace this part of me as still a good quality, but I'm going to learn again boundaries, 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 boundaries.
Yeah.
When is it time to be patient? And when is it time to stand up and say, you know, now that came across really rude. Did you intend to be rude?
Love that response.
It's potent.
It is, and it just puts it in. I love it that it gives the other person a chance to self-reflect for 2 seconds and hopefully step back, or at the best, they just step away from me.
Yeah.
You know, they
Yeah.
might
At least they
flounder
try to
around a bit.
at least they try to save face, right?
Yeah.
They step back and go, yeah, of course I didn't mean that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have the abuser assigns responsibility to the person that they are abusing.
Mhm.
An abuser makes the victim responsible for their choices
Yes.
or for the abuser's choices. What's number three?
Number three, they make the abuse victim responsible for their protection.
Oh,
Don't tell,
oh
you know,
yeah. This
don't,
is our
don't,
little secret.
yeah, don't let the people outside of our little marriage or outside of our relationship know.
Hmm.
And the victim often, even unconsciously, takes on that role of protection.
Yes.
I don't want to make them look bad. It's
Yes.
interesting because in many cases, psychological abuse, my friend Shannon Thomas has a book called Healing from Hidden Abuse.
Hmm.
A number of people in that space who refer to it in some way to say it's often out of sight because it doesn't look the way we expect it to.
Hmm.
And part of why it doesn't look the way we expect it to is in the early stages, the victim will never say or do anything to make their partner look bad
Right.
because it's their job to help them become the amazing person that they're sure that they are. And so they'll cover for them verbally, they'll cover for them behaviorally, and they'll protect them from their irresponsibility until kind of the shift happens. The shift is when they start to go, wait, now I understand what's happening.
Yeah. I see people even do that in counseling. They won't talk about it in counseling.
Right. It's so unconscious until it's made conscious.
Uh-huh.
It's they minimize it, they deny it. And it's one of the ways a minute ago when you were talking about like what was real and what wasn't real. One of the metaphors I've used is it's like we as abuse victims create a movie set that looks like an old West town. But if
Hmm.
you look behind the front of the buildings, it's just, planks and boards.
Right.
And so we have to, part of the truth setting us free is examining that enough to go, okay, I'm going to stop being in denial. And part of my denial has been minimizing my partner's behavior, minimizing my attempts to prop them up,
Hmm.
minimizing my attempts to do their work for them, and just look right at it and call it what it is.
And facing their own shame of being the abuse. Yeah, I think that in protecting the abuser, sometimes they're protecting themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a emotionally difficult, you and I know because of what we do.
Hmm.
You get behind closed doors with people, and there are reasons why everybody struggles. Those
Right.
reasons are legitimate reasons. We just have to help them know that there's the other form of struggle is healthier and stronger.
Hmm.
So it's easier in the long run, it's easier to struggle with acknowledging the truth than it is to continue to struggle by hiding it.
Yeah. Yeah. Then the next thing that I've seen, and I'm wondering, I think this was your number four, but I can't remember off the top of my head, to be honest with you. I'm sorry about that, Bob.
Oh,
But I see this a lot with people who have been raped, is somebody asking them, well, were you dressed provocatively?
yes. Yeah.
And it's like other people join
It's
in continuing that abuse.
it's 99% of the time that what I call the onlookers, abuse is always triangular.
Uh-huh.
There's a victim, there's an abuser, and then there's the onlookers.
Okay.
And the onlookers may actually be professionals like you and I.
Uh-huh.
I look back at the different couples that I counseled in the 90s and realized that in my immaturity and not understanding what I teach these days, there are a number of people I sent back into abusive dynamics to try harder to do better,
Uh-huh.
which is the exact opposite of what they should have been doing. And so we, the onlookers, first of all, we believe their initial report, right? I'm
Mm-hmm.
just trying to help him become the amazing person. And by the way, I didn't say this, but the abuser usually says, I don't really have a problem. My partner is the problem. And if they would change, I wouldn't be so angry. Or if
Right.
they would change, I wouldn't drink so much, whatever it might
Yes.
be.
Uh-huh.
And so we believe the initial report. And when we take that on, it's like you said, there's an automatic assumption. And particularly, I think in the Christian world, Audra,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the Christian world, we are told that forgiveness is such a core value that we apply it in wrong circumstances and wrong timing.
Mm-hmm.
And wrong circumstances are when the dynamic is ongoing, forgiveness is not the tool to utilize, right? When the
Yeah.
dynamic is ongoing, boundaries and consequences are the tool to utilize. But commonly, and I've used this illustration before, if you're from the kind of faith where people come down front to pray after a service and ask for prayer for their life and circumstances, it's not uncommon to have someone come down and say, my wife has left. She didn't even tell me she was unhappy. She's staying with friends and her friends are supporting her and she won't even talk to me. I don't even know what the problem is. And in many, many cases, I now look back at that and go, that was the abusive partner who was asking me to pray for them to get back together
Yeah.
because they know they can say to the onlookers, me as the pastor at the church, me as a counselor in my office, maybe even the lay leaders at a church are good friends, that you can make those kind of statements and people immediately feel sympathy for the abuser. And by definition, if they feel sympathy for the abuser, they hold responsibility to the victim. And like you said, it happens in rapes all the time. The question, well, what were you wearing? Why were
Yeah.
you there after midnight? How much had you been drinking? And implicit in that is the assumption you brought this on yourself in some way.
You brought it on yourself. And to me, one of the key comments is in those situations that you were talking about is, I don't even know what was wrong. I didn't know anything was wrong. That to me is a big red flag. I hate the term, but it's a big red flag that
Right.
says there's where the root of the problem is,
Yeah.
right?
Because when I've traced those down, when I've followed those cases,
Hmm.
the partner who has left says, I told him 25 times.
Yes.
I said it, I wrote it, I screamed it, I whispered it,
Yeah.
I put it in typewritten, I hand wrote it,
Yeah.
I put it on the walls. I told him 25 times. If he didn't know, it's because he chose to ignore it.
But I don't even know what happened is a victim role, which
Yeah,
is the covert abuser.
right.
Yeah.
Because they're responsible.
Right.
I and it comes across like they're such a hero.
Uh-huh.
I've tried so hard. And that's important in the treatment process because often what they say is, listen, I've stopped this, I've stopped this, I've stopped this.
Hmm.
But the key for us as therapists is to learn that covert assignment of responsibility. Because if they follow it up and say, I've stopped this, I've stopped this, I've stopped this, and they still won't forgive me,
Hmm.
there's the covert assignment of responsibility. They're
Yeah.
still saying, I've done all these things and they won't let me back in. Interesting. So they are the problem. You're still assigning responsibility to them.
Hmm.
And until they can say things like this, I really hurt them and they have every right to be safe and to get away from me. I regret what I did. And if they leave me and never come back, I would understand.
Yeah.
Till those words can come out of their mouth, then there's to some degree, they're still saying, I'm doing right. They're doing wrong by not letting me back in.
Yeah. So I want to circle back on one comment you just made about forgiveness. And I want to clarify something in that because I understand what you're saying about it's not the right tool to use at that moment. And if you're thinking about forgiveness being full circle forgiveness of we continue the relationship without big change, right? But I think forgiveness is always a tool to be called for when it's
Yeah.
about how I'm feeling in my heart to keep a root of bitterness from happening. But that doesn't mean it's a safe thing to continue a relationship with somebody who is unsafe.
Yeah. Great distinction
Yeah.
and a very important distinction because forgiveness is really about me no longer being a slave to other people's mistreatment. Right.
Yeah.
And so I was using it in the broader sense of overlooking ongoing misbehavior.
Hmm.
But very much what you just described, that forgiveness is a way to say, listen, I can still set boundaries out of love.
Hmm.
If I forgive, I can set boundaries out of love, and it doesn't have to come out of fear or anger.
Yeah.
But if I'm still setting boundaries only out of fear and anger, then I'm still carrying the scars of the abuse.
Hmm.
When I can learn to say, listen, I forgive them, boundaries can still be maintained, but I now do it not because I'm terrified or because I'm full of rage. I
Yeah.
now do it because love sets boundaries.
Love sets boundaries. Love
That
that.
could, that could be a book, right? Love
That
sets
could be a book. Think differently about love.
That's actually next on the slate, by the way.
Is it really?
But it's now all the books are Think Differently, L differently.
Uh-huh.
It'll be Think Differently, Love differently.
There you go.
We've got a
Huh.
few outlines here and there, but we're not into the meat of it yet.
So to tie this up today, tell me if what you would say to anybody who is sitting on that side of the couch across from you, and then
Yeah.
what you would like them to hear in this moment, and then also what you would like for a counselor who's sitting on this side of the couch to hear.
Well, let me start with the second question.
Okay.
That's what I would love for the people sitting on as the counselor. I would love for them to hear that how you may have conceptualized this case, if you take the word of your clients, may actually be feeding the negative dynamic instead of resolving it.
Mm,
When you can define it as who is carrying rightly their responsibility, now you can move towards wholeness and healing for both partners. In other words, kind of at the root of all this is just the idea that emotional and mental health comes from moving from dependence to independence. And so when people can take responsibility for themselves, both the victim and the abuser can learn to no longer be enmeshed with their partner as their source of well-being, whether that be I'll accept responsibility because I'm the abuse victim, or I'll assign responsibility because I'm the abuser. The right assignment of responsibility, the movement towards individuation, both from family of origin and from the relationship itself, which is generally most often a repetition of a family of origin pattern, that movement towards taking full responsibility for themselves, not expecting their partner to do so, to me is one of the central pieces of work in the relationship.
okay.
If you're working with the abuse victim, and this is where I would kind of transition into the first question you asked,
Yeah.
but also to say what I would say to the counselor. The real deep work of recovery is ultimately to help them rediscover who they were before the abuse started. There is a tendency, and not a wrong tendency. I think it's important. There is a tendency in the middle stages of treatment, and both for the client and the therapist, there's a tendency to educate yourself about things like the dynamics of abuse, the nature of a narcissist. What does narcissism look like in relationship? There's a tendency to think the more educated I become on those things, the more I can heal.
Yeah.
And the reality is, the more educated you become, the more you may be able to recognize and protect. But recognize and protect isn't the same thing as healing.
Hmm.
And there often comes kind of there's a transition process. I just described this on another podcast where at first you don't even know it's abuse. Then you discover that it's abuse, and then you start to educate yourself about abuse. And at some point, you make a decision to get out of abuse, whether that means stay in it but no longer participate in the covert agreement or get out. And then there becomes the healing part, which we connect that education to healing. But I would say that the ultimate healing is to answer the question, who was I before the abuse happened? And find that person again. It's not simply about getting rid of the pain or getting rid of the belief systems of abuse. It's about recovering the person. Like you said, no person is born with low self-esteem. No
Yeah.
person is born an abuser, and no person is born an abuse victim.
Hmm.
So find that person again. There comes a point where turning people again to go, like, listen, before the relationship, who were you? And I'm just going to say there's a percentage of people that answer the question, I've never not been in abuse.
Right.
You had my wife on your podcast a while back, and she's one of those who would say, I don't remember a time in my life who was or when I was not being abused. She started being sexually abused at age 3.
Hmm.
So when we discuss that question, she's answering the question, who was I created to be?
Right.
So she may not have as much of a visceral experience of having been that person. She's almost having to answer it first spiritually
Hmm.
in her connection and conversation with God, in her ongoing walk in his presence. She's learning who she is. And then out of that intellectually, so first spiritually, then intellectually, then leading to experience of, so who am I really? I'm not just someone who was abused and I overcame. I'm someone who was created for something on purpose. And abuse was a detour.
That's the word I was just thinking when you were thinking of a word. Detour
Yeah.
is the great word.
So I would want the people sitting, listening to this now, if you're wherever you are in that process, to know
Mm-hmm.
person you were created to be is still in there somewhere. And you can still find her or him, and you can still live the life you were created for.
Yeah.
There's some
See,
hard stuff ahead, but you can still live the life you're created for.
thank you for joining me today, Bob.
Oh, Audra, thanks. It's been great.
So tell everybody where they can find you online.
Ah, so my wife and I both have our resources at Think Differently Academy, which is
Mm-hmm.
tdacad.com, tdacad.com.
Okay.
It's a membership site. And so it's like $12 a month to be a member. But we also have committed that the initial abuse teachings will always be free. So even if you can't afford that $12 or don't want to afford the $12 a month, you can access the abuse teaching that I've somewhat referenced during our time together.
Yeah.
But all of our video, all of our print resources, everything we teach in our live events are all hosted right there at tdacad.com.
All right. Thank you. It's always great chatting with you, Bob.
Thanks, Audra.
See you later.
Bye.
Thanks so much for joining us on this side of the couch today. If you think it's been worth your time and energy, please like and subscribe and share it and tell your closest 10,000 friends. If this show has revealed that you could benefit from counseling, then the next step is certainly finding the right counselor for you. If you're in Texas, the Rush Creek Counseling Center is ready for you. Give us a call at 817-704-6991 or visit our website at rushcreekcounseling.org. That's Rush, R-U-S-H, Creek, C-R-E-E-K, counseling.org. If you are outside of Texas, I still encourage you to seek out a counselor and step onto that path of healing. Now go have an awesome day.